It's great to be with you again. My name is Jeff Fuller. You can find all things Jay Fuller interviews on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And I love having guests share their stories because I think we need to be hero makers and not just trying to be the hero. And Glenn Stout has a great story for us. And Glenn, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks very much.
So glennstout.net is your website, if I'm correct. It is net, not .com, and it has two N's in it. When you came up with a website, did you think you wanted to be witty and creative, or did you just say, hey, my name is what matters, and this is what I'm going to put up?
Well, this is, it's the first thing I typed in, right? I didn't put a whole lot of thought into it. So.
And I just want to get right away to the fact of being a Vermonter now, even though a lot of native Vermonters might call you a flatlander or whatever. But you are an author. Could you just talk about when you were younger? Where did your love of writing come from? Where did it begin?
Well, I was always a big reader when I was a kid, but like a lot of kids, I think, initially all I read was, sports stories for boys, the Babe Ruth story. I remember reading the Lou Burdett story and things like that. But what really changed for me and made me a writer was, I think I was about 13 years old. And we had an assignment at school that we had to put together a collection of poems and illustrate them. And as a 13-year-old, I'm like, poems? What are you talking about? But my brother, who was 4 years older, a little more aware, obviously, he handed me, I think it was an anthology, or maybe it was just a collection, but it was Langston Hughes. And I was blown away. That was the moment when I realized that words had power, and that words could change you. I mean, why did Langston Hughes, a Harlem Renaissance poet from the 1920s, resonate with a kid growing up in a small town in central Ohio? It makes no sense except for the fact that words have power. And that was it for me. And I basically followed the track of Langston Hughes through American literature, starting with that. Who did he read? Who was around then? So on and so forth. And, by the time I left high school, after, working on the school newspaper and things like that, I went to college on a scholarship for creative writing for poetry. And circuitously ended up doing a lot of sports writing, oddly enough, but it's still part of the same thing. I think, you realize that words have power and that they can change lives in ways large and small. And I think that's why a lot of people write. It's writing is not something you want to do at a certain point. And I think now it's even more important than ever, but it's something that you feel like you have to do.
Yeah.
And that's what it was for me since I was about 13 years old. And I consider myself incredibly lucky and incredibly fortunate that I've been able to do this much of my adult life.
That's pretty amazing. And I think people would look at your books and say, oh, you started in sports or interest in sports. And I'd like to get to that in a moment. My brother, he's older. He is just very much black and white. And I remember when he was in high school, he had an assignment, creative writing, and he could not do it because he said that didn't really happen. Did you enjoy the fact that you could bring fiction into your writing, or was that you wanted some part of truth to be a part of that story?
Well, you were trying to learn about the world and learn about yourself, and writing is kind of magic at a certain point. We're just the vessel. We're not necessarily in control of it. And when I started writing poetry, I would discover things that I didn't know, and I would think things that I didn't know. And even when I went into nonfiction, I kind of, I don't plot things out in great detail ahead of time. I do my thinking on the page. So I might start out thinking I'm going to write about this subject in a certain way, but the writing process itself reveals other things. And I try to listen, and this is kind of comes from poetry. I try to listen to the text and see, I think, stories and words kind of exist outside yourself. And as a writer, your task is to listen to what's on the page and to try to bring that out, not to be a dictator trying to control everything. And that's where the real interest, that's where the real, interest is. And that's what makes it kind of sustaining. And, you can get into a zone where time just falls away. And you're in this very creative process of learning.
For sure. When we first met, I was on the radio, local radio station WDV here in Vermont, and you were generous with your time and just shared about writing books about the Boston Red Sox, Fenway 1912. I think at the time is what we discussed, but I had the opportunity to interview Pat Williams, and he said, "You do not write a book; you rewrite a book after it goes in, and all the editors hit it." Is that a frustrating process for you, or as you have done it several times now, what are your thoughts about going into that process with that mindset?
Well, it can be very frustrating. I've also done a great deal of editing of other writers too, and I think the best editors, and I tried to be the best I could. You try to develop a partnership and a collaboration with the writer, so you're not coming in as an editor and telling them what to do and telling them what to do without explanation or anything like that. Some editors are more amenable to that than others. I think it takes a great deal of experience to, quite frankly, to develop that relationship with a writer. I don't know if I could have done it when I was younger, but I've done that with a number of younger writers I've worked at where, get them to the point where, we're working towards the same goal here. And I'm going to listen real hard to what you're trying to do. And I'm going to listen real hard to what the words are trying to do. And let's try to move it that way rather than just come in on top. We're going to take this out. We're going to move this, that kind of stuff, which I find kind of crass and not very satisfying for anybody. So that's how I kind of look at the editorial process.
So there's a leadership quote that I like. I don't know if I exemplify it yet, but it says, "Good leaders ask trusted friends to question their leadership." How important is it that we develop that self-awareness? And I just want to ask, early on in writing, were you as humble or open to that criticism as you've become?
Um, I don't know if I'm more open to it then or more open to it now, quite frankly. In some ways, I think I'm more confident in what I'm doing now than I was when I was younger. So maybe I'm actually a little harder about it. But at the same token, over time, particularly since I moved to Vermont, where, let's face it, we're rather remote, and the community of writers is not what it had been when I, was living down in Boston and things like that. But, I've developed a circle of trusted writer friends, and we talk to each other all the time. I mean, almost every single day, I have an extended conversation with one of my writer friends, and there's probably 20 or 25 in the loose circle that I have, and 5 or 6 in a much tighter circle. So, we're discussing, in addition to industry gossip and all that stuff, we're also discussing how we actually do this and the challenges of actually doing this and the issues we face in our various projects, the issues we face with our editors, the issues we face with the industry, with trying to, create a sustainable life in the industry, all that stuff. So that's been really, that support system is hugely important. I've had the opportunity to teach at some extended workshops where we've been with smaller groups of writers, 10 or 12, and have developed that community among ourselves. And I just find, one of the things I counsel younger writers now is to get your tribe together. Find those people that understand you, that will challenge you, that you can discuss this with, because it's a very isolating thing. I mean, the one part of writing nobody ever talks about really is, when I'm on the midst of a book project or something, it's me and this screen for 6 or 8 hours a day for a year. Okay.
Yeah.
No one else is here. My daughter, who still lives with us, is 24 years old. And I like to tell the story that when she was younger, people would ask, "What does Daddy do?" And she would say, "Well, he talks on the phone." Because, of course, she never saw me typing at the keyboard.
Right.
That was, not there. I didn't do that out in front with everybody. So that's the kind of challenge that you have to come up with, because it can be really isolating, and you have to trick yourself into it not being isolating.
I had the privilege of interviewing Jeff Pearlman a little bit ago, and he was just talking about the importance of writing, but getting to meet and speak with those that you're writing about and of. And for me, being a huge Red Sox fan, and just how have you been able to, and maybe you didn't have to, but I know for me, I think I'd have to balance being a fan with being an author. Did you have to ever get starstruck? Did you have to balance that at all with those you were speaking with?
Not really. It's funny because even though I'm probably best known in a lot of ways for writing so much about the Red Sox, I've never been a Red Sox fan. I always tell people I'm a baseball fan. I got to Boston and didn't know anything about Boston when I was, I don't know, about 22 years old. And I just found Boston kind of an interesting place. And I was working at the Boston Public Library, and I liked baseball, and I wanted to move to a city that had an old ballpark, which is why I went to Boston. Plus, I had some friends there. But I just got intrigued with the history of the team, which I think was really revealing. It said a lot about the city. It was kind of the way, in many ways, that I learned about the city of Boston, was when I started to mine the history of the Red Sox. And I did that basically because the things I wanted to know had not been written about before.
Yeah.
So, the Red Sox are one of the handful of really essential Major League Baseball franchises. And their story is really rich. It touches on a lot of other issues. And that's something I've tried to do in my work over time. And then I've expanded that to write about other teams and so on and so forth. But, I had somebody once tell me, "Oh, I couldn't write about, I have to be a fan, or I couldn't write about it." I don't write as a fan. That's, the truth, and what you discover stands by itself. And if I find an uncomfortable truth, well, I'm going to write the uncomfortable truth. I don't care if a fan is put off by it or anything. If I tell my story well enough, I think they'll come along. Rick Tellender, who was one of the editors of the Best American Sports Writing, he was with Sports Illustrated for a long time, and now he's with the Chicago Sun-Times. I had a conversation with Rick one time, and he said to me, "Glenn, let's face it," he says, "we really don't care about sports. We care about all the things that sports allows us to write about."
Yeah.
Whether that's power or class or race or, a host of other issues, personal challenges, adversity, all this stuff. Sports is the conduit that gets us there. And what I think is really interesting is, because you're writing about sports, or say the Red Sox, you can get this large group of people to kind of at the door of your book or your story. And they're gonna walk in because it's about baseball, because it's about their team. Once they're in the door and you've got their ear, you can take them places that otherwise they might not want to go. And places that they might not realize that they're really interested in.
And I want to just thank you for that. I think that's a great vantage point of just saying, I'm not a fan. I'm just revealing what took place. And sometimes the stories that fans cover up or organizations cover up, you get to expose those. And it really enlightens a fan of what takes place. This is a poor transition, but I just want to make it with everything taking place in our culture today, in society today, with George Floyd and everything that's happening. I just think of Jackie Robinson and how baseball came together, and how sports has helped heal when injustice has happened. First question is, how important is it that sports comes back on a national level that we can watch to find common ground? And then the second question is, how do we recover as a society with all of this injustice taking place?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I was having a discussion with one of my tribe about this the other day. And, we brought up the fact that maybe one of the factors, and certainly COVID is there too as a major factor. But one of the factors that maybe has opened the door for this reckoning that's taking place now all around us is the fact that, sports isn't there. It was a mark, sports is the opiate for the people. But maybe the fact that sports isn't there has opened up some space for some real self-reflection. And I think what we're starting to see as sports is sort of beginning to open up or thinking about opening up. The Red Sox put out a statement yesterday where they essentially acknowledged their racial history and the issues they've had with it, and that it's ongoing. It's not something that just took place in the past. That wouldn't have happened before. So it's allowed, I think, a big movement to take place, a shift in attitude where people have had the time to reassess and kind of see why this matters to them. It will be interesting to see how much of that is retained when sports takes place again, or do people just use sports as an excuse to look away from issues, to, hide themselves from the world? I wonder to a degree if sports might end up, at least for a time period, being a little less important. The habit's been broken. And as my friends in Montreal can tell me, after the baseball strike, where, the Expos went from being one of the most popular tickets in Montreal, it was almost as but like the Canadians. After the strike, they were just done with that. We've had it. So that's the challenge sports will have to take, is to kind of regain its relevancy and, regain the place that it holds in people's hearts and minds, because that's gone right now. So it will be interesting. I'm fascinated by what it's going to look like in a year.
Yeah,
I don't think it'll be the same. It'll be different, but I don't know how.
Yeah, and I think it's going to need to be different, but I agree. And it's just funny with your kids being home and homeschooling, and you realize, like, man, I really would like them out of the house, even though I love them with all of my heart. It's just difficult. And I'm not sure if you knew, but I'm a pastor, and I had a conversation yesterday with Myron Pierce and another gentleman, and it's during this time frame, it's almost like I've been fighting against it. Find your black friend, put him in front of a camera, and let's talk about race. And I think that is not doing justice to the conversation as well. For you
No.
as a writer, do you feel pressure to put pen to paper or hand to keyboard and write on this issue?
Not directly, and not at the moment. Everybody's heard from me on this issue. Okay. I mean, I quite frankly, when I started writing about sports, a lot of the stories I were drawn to in Boston were stories that had been overlooked, which were stories about African Americans. They were stories about women, marginalized populations. And when I started writing books, Red Sox Century, for instance, which is 20 years old, which was the first big comprehensive history of the Red Sox, was also the first book to really address the racial issue of the Red Sox directly and honestly, I think. And I think sparked some other people to do that going forward. But right now, it's kind of like a white writer. We need to give space for people who don't look like me, and certainly give them support, give people support, and all of that. But let's not drown out their voice with people like me telling my experience and what I think, because I think for too long, that's sort of been the dominant way to address it. Oh yeah, we might interview someone and put the face on the screen, but we're not going to give them the time and the space to write about it. And I have, a number of African American writer friends, and it was heartbreaking the other day for one of them. She emailed me and she said her inbox is full of queries now from editors, and she's been having a really tough time, placing stories for the last year or two. And she says, all it took was a black man to be killed on camera for me to become popular.
That's terrible.
Which is pretty harsh, but it's pretty true. And, but we need to hear from people like her, and it's time to give space to people like her. And, the approach that I took 30 some odd years ago when I started writing these stories, writing about stories that hadn't been written about. People like, Major Taylor, who was a great African-American bike racer in the 1890s, or Louise Stokes, who was one of the first Black women on an American Olympic team. I told those stories.
Yeah.
Somebody else probably should have been telling those stories.
Right.
And whether they weren't given the opportunity or what, those aren't necessarily my stories to tell, right? Not that you can't still write about race and you can't still write about, people who don't look like me, but the industry as a whole, society as a whole, has to make space for people to own their own stories and to tell them in their own way.
No, I certainly agree. And I do thank you for sharing their stories when others probably didn't have the opportunity as you had. So thank you so much. And Glenn Stout, always a pleasure. I got to let you go. But before I do, I want to let you know I'll take you out to lunch or dinner whenever this is all done, just being that fellow Vermonter right now.
There you go.
But what is a story from your writing that you just it sticks in your mind that you just love telling, love sharing? Just one story in particular that you always think of when you think
Boy,
about
that's a real challenge. But I think it didn't get a great deal of attention. But I did a book with the guys who cleaned up the World Trade Center after 9/11, the construction workers, and that kind of touches on something that we were just talking about. Is there had been books about 9/11. There was a big book about the top-down activity that did the cleanup of the Trade Center. But the book that I did, it was an oral history done with primarily 2 construction workers who were there every day for 9 months. Wow. And they got to tell a story about that quite frankly didn't appear before and hasn't appeared since. I think if you would have asked most people, they thought the police and fire did all the cleanup work. Well, no, they were only on a couple of week rotations at a time. The construction workers were there 24/7 for 9 months. That's the kind of looking where other people aren't looking and trying to tell some stories that are otherwise being overlooked. And, I was a former construction worker, so I kind of understood these guys. And I also understood that nobody writes about construction workers, right? Their lives, their attitudes. And I'm very proud of the fact that book actually brought that out. And, people found some resonance in it. And it told a story that would otherwise, to this day, still be untold. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell stories that otherwise won't be told. That, I don't want to write the same thing that somebody has written 10 different times. I want to write the stories that haven't been told or haven't been told thoroughly or completely, or in some cases haven't been told in this current context that we're in, because history is cumulative. It changes. Your perspectives change, access to information changes. And you can tell a story 15 years ago and tell it again now, and there will be a shift of one way or another. Yes, there's truth, but truth resonates in different ways.
Certainly true. What's the title of that book again?
That's called 9 Months at Ground Zero. It's probably long out of print at this point, but it was a fascinating experience. And then just to allow people into what they considered the most important and intimate act of their life, and to gain their trust over nearly 100 hours of interviews, and sit there with them while they're crying, telling their stories, and listening to them, telling me things that they hadn't told their wives, they hadn't told each other. Sometimes, that was a formative experience.
And I think it was a poignant point you brought up earlier that maybe it's been good for us without sports, so we can really reflect and hear these stories like this that takes place, so we understand what truly does matter. Glenn, thank you so much for making the time, getting up early and sharing with us. It's been a pleasure, and thanks again.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it, Jeff.
And again, that's Glenn Stout. You can find more information about him, glenstout.net. And we look forward to talking with you again soon and sharing people's stories of the stories that they've heard, because our stories make every one of us much better. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks so much. You can subscribe Jay Fuller Interviews on YouTube.